Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, Linked Youth. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about afterlife and how life is understood by different people in different places at different times. I'm here with Mr. Caleb. How are you doing, Mr. Caleb?
Hello, Eliangel. I'm doing very good. Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. Before we start, we're going to go with a short video about a curiosity of something that happened before life existed. Caleb, go ahead.
Hello, did you know that English today is known as a lingua franca? That means common language, literally meaning language of the French or Franks. This was because during the 17th century, French was actually the lingua franca that our founding fathers spoke. Many of them knew it very fluently, and before French, it was actually Latin. And among Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Akkadian were the most commonly spoken languages around the world. This was usually meant to be as diplomatic choices between nations and kings, and even other small city-states. Today, English remains the lingua franca of the world, but even before English, there were many languages that were spoken before.
Thank you so much, Caleb. That's very impressive for me. I didn't know that, at least. I'm pretty sure many of the listeners didn't know that still or also. Let's talk about what happened before life. Like, we often think about afterlife, what happens after life, but we don't think about what happened with us before life come into existence. Have you thought about that before?
Not necessarily.
Like history, right? Like history happens even before we exist, but like we haven't thought about us before we exist, right?
Right. Perhaps only the founding fathers at least just thought of the people who would come into existence, and they would actually think, or the laws they enacted, they would always analyze how would it impact those people.
Wow. So that's a very good thought. What do you think about how we relate with death and life when it comes to, like, let's say, for example, when we are alive, we enjoy things, we suffer, we cry, we struggle. But then when life ceases to exist, there's most of the people mourn or crying or pain because we lost somebody that we used to love. And the person goes back to the original state before that person existed, right? Like the person is not suffering anymore, according to what the Bible says at least. But we don't cry those people that don't exist nowadays. Like we don't cry the people that are not existing nowadays and are not enjoying life nowadays and they're going to be born 20 years from now. We don't cry them because we don't even know them. And probably that gives me a sense or a reason to believe that life is good. Many people doubt about that because of the pain, the suffering, the struggles, but in general, we can probably all agree that life is good, right?
Correct. What you said is interesting because a French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, actually made or rather his contributions to philosophy were important because he thought of the essence of things. So basically, the essence of this cup right here was made so we could drink from it. But he famously quoted, "Existence precedes essence," meaning a knife, scissors, the way they exist, their very essence are made to cut things. For us, or at least for the knife, we gave it that purpose and that meaning. For us, he thought, before we're born, we have no purpose. We, as we grow up, as a child begins to move on to childhood, manhood, they begin to choose their own purpose. They begin to be interested in whatever they seek, and then they find a reason to live. So that's how they begin to earn purpose. That's how, in a way, they bring value to themselves.
So that's how he understood it, like existence precedes essence. Do you agree with that?
To a certain degree, I guess you could say in the secular world, yes, because people keep saying, what is the purpose of life? And a lot of it has to do with just live your life to the fullest, leave the world a better place than when you first arrived. And that makes sense, but the problem is that it depends on the choices people make. And he said people are condemned to be free.
Wow, that's a deep thought. Now, let me make a comment on that, because it is interesting for me, because I thought about that the other way around. Like, essence precedes existence, and probably you know what where I'm coming from, because if it comes from within, like the purpose, if the purpose comes from within, then yes, existence precedes essence. But if the purpose comes from outside, then essence precedes existence. For example, the example that you use with the cup, with the knife, we were talking before the podcast about that somebody external to the object had a purpose in order to create that object, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the purpose precedes the existence of the object. In the same manner, there is somebody that had a purpose in order for us to exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. So in that sense, life has a purpose that is, the purpose is not defined by the person, because the person doesn't understand completely itself. The person has to find the meaning of life, or the purpose of life, outside himself in order to understand what's the real meaning or purpose of life. So it's very interesting how philosophy can take you from one point, or take you or you can go from one point to the other point, depending on from where you are defining the reality, let's say. So before, we were talking about before life, and now we're going to go with afterlife. What happens after life? But before we move forward with the afterlife, I have a question for all of you. And the question is this: what is the longest living person nowadays? Do you have an idea? Do you have a clue? Probably you heard about somebody before, an old person that is living in some country that went above 100 years. But let me tell you that the longest living person alive nowadays is found in the Bible, and the name is Enoch. He is actually 4,700 plus years on earthly years, because we don't know if they count years like in the earth, in heaven. But Enoch is the longest living person on record. So we know that right now, that's a crazy thought, Caleb. Like, Enoch is still alive. 4,000 years of experience, maturity. That's something really crazy. So moving forward with afterlife, what do other people believe about the origin of life, Caleb? Do you know what other religions or tribes or people believe about that?
I guess really religions, how it started, at least in myths, how they try to apply it, was that the existence of humans, before there were humans, there were the gods. Or there were these gods, and these gods began to multiply. And in some cases, humans were brought forth to existence, and the purpose for these humans was to serve these gods, and these gods were dependent on humans and offering sacrifices and even bringing them food to them. So in a way, that's somewhat of people think the origin of life was. There are now different theories out there, and this was particularly true for the Egyptians and in Mesopotamia, Chaldeans, Sumerians, and usually the temples were dedicated to the gods, where the temple was is where the god resided. So a lot of them had theories or more mythologies and legends of how everything came to be. The Egyptians thought that the first god came from this mass of water. Then they began producing gods from themselves, and then humans came forth. The same thing with the Babylonians. With Babylon, at least, humans, they say they were being formed from clay, and I believe it was from the blood of the gods that actually gave life to them.
That's so crazy, because all those concepts of blood, life coming from the god or whatever, those somehow goes back to the original event that brought about life, which is the creation of humankind. They all misled with different mythologies and different beliefs, but they all have somehow something that goes back to the Genesis. And it is very interesting for me that you mentioned those um, times, because you go back in history and you see that the biblical history, the biblical record, points from the very beginning of creation of humanity to now, till now. And it is concise, it is precise, and is the most successful narrative of the creation. It gives you reasons to believe in purpose for your life, and it also tells you talk to you about the future. So it's not only talking about the past, but it's also talking about the present and the future, which didn't happen with the Chaldeans or the Egyptians. They are like mythology.
Right, and a comment I want to add to that, there's this actually Egyptologist who even pointed that out, that the Bible in the Near East is the only book that actually writes like a history book. You don't see that in Mesopotamia. You don't see that in Egypt, at least for the Greeks. But even in the Greeks, such as Homer's Iliad, Odyssey, that writes also more like mythology. It is kind of the first historical narrative, but it also has mythology mixed in it. And the Bible is really the only book that presents a chronological order. Another thing is that a Bible has such a humble beginning, whereas other mythologies have gods fighting each other, exalting, make sure that you present the pharaoh, the kings, as more for praise. But the Bible, where it starts from God creating everything and from their sprouting the human seed. And then we even have stories like major biblical characters have humble beginnings, Noah, Abraham, and David. So it's a big contrast of how it's presented to us.
Yes. I really appreciate that comment, Caleb. When it comes to Christianity, nowadays, most Christians believe that after we die, our soul or whatever goes out of the body goes to either heaven or hell, depending on how the person behaved when the person was alive. But since we're talking about the reliability of the Bible and how it is concise, like through history, and how it talks about history, it talks about truth, and we can trust in that differently with the Mesopotamian books or like the tablets and all of that. Like we can trust in the Bible because it has already been confirmed through archaeology, through history. Even nowadays, the Western world is dividing time with an event that is the birth of Christ, like before Christ, after Christ. That's all in history. So bringing the point of the Bible as a foundation for our beliefs and the understanding of afterlife, we know that many people don't see afterlife as Christians see, but also there are some commonalities between the Christianity, mainly speaking, most mainline Christianity religions, and also the other religions that are not Christians, like Hinduism, let's say, with the belief of reincarnation, or like Islam and other religions. Like they all believe that after you die, you don't actually stop existing, but you go to a different type of existence, right? Like, and that brings me to the point of the Greeks, like the Greek philosophy when it comes to the Platonic dualism that entered into the church in earlier times, like beginning of this new era. Probably you know a little bit more about that you want to explain how this dualism affected us nowadays.
Really, I think dualism, I'll point out like how it affected now more of the 21st century idea, or even before that. And really, Plato wanted to outline that the world or our reality was divided into two: the physical and the mental, or the mind, the thoughts. And the reason for that was because we can't see thoughts, and that's where all emotions and feelings, desires come from. Another thing is that those are secluded. We can't see those. Those are things that are hidden from us, while our bodies are temporal. Like we can die out, we can grow old. And he also believed the soul was eternal, like two things that made the body. This also comes where René Descartes was a French philosopher, and he kind of wanted to reinforce this idea that it was through the brain that we do all our actions. anything I think, anything I feel, see, sense, and or see, it's all through the brain.
Subjective,
Right.
basically.
Everything the brain can sense, like if I move my hand, that was a direct signal from my brain. And in my brain is where I think, where I feel, where all forms of imagination come from. So it's in a way a perfect thing, and perfect ideas such as numbers. They always use math as a way to prove, perfectness, because 3 + 3 is 6, and you will still get that same answer. The sides of a triangle will always be equal to each other, depending.
Yeah.
So it's that concept where they thought that, or at least Plato tried to justify why the soul and the physical body were two separate things.
Yeah.
And we see that influence that in the church, but also in modern day entertainment and culture. Many people believe, especially movies, depict someone's soul leaving their body and the body stays behind.
Yeah.
And whether we believe it or not, that's still stems from what Plato's dualism presented to us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that it has affected us so much, and it was affecting the Christianity people from back in the time, the early church. It was already affecting them because you see some ascetic ideas and ideas that believed that Jesus couldn't have come in the flesh because the flesh was evil, according to that Platonic understanding. Like all of the world of the ideas was good and perfect and marvelous, and the earthly thing, the physical world, was full of sin, suffering, pain, and it was bad or evil. So if God himself made himself human, then he became evil in the flesh. And some Christians, early Christians, couldn't believe that. So they were like, probably Jesus didn't come. He made it appear like he came, but he didn't. And that's why John even says in one of his letters that everybody who accepts or admits that Jesus came in the flesh comes from God. Basically, he was rebating or going against that tendency that happened in early Christianity. But is that like the only thing that is found in the Bible according to the dualism? Paul also makes some statements about like the flesh and the body, that I want to be absent from the body but present with the Lord. And some people have used that as an argument to believe that, yeah, there is a soul that goes to heaven, goes to the presence of God, while the body is resting on the earth and going back to the dust. And I think this is a good time to go to what the Bible actually says about what happens after life. And I would like to point to you on the Bible to go to the book of Genesis, because if we want to know what happens after life, then we need to know what happened before life, human life exists. Let's go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And you can read for me, please. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7.
All right, Genesis 2, verse 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul.
Wow, that word soul is interesting because it's also translated as living being, living soul, meaning that soul, according to the first terminology used in the book of Genesis, is referring to a person, like the whole person, not just one side of it. It's not like God creates the person in different parts. He creates the person as a whole, and that's marvelous. The fact that we can perceive ourselves as created by God, the physical, our bodies are good, are not evil, because God created us physically. He used the dust of the ground to create us, and he shaped us. Instead of saying, let there be man and woman, he decides to shape us, form us according to his image and likeness. And that's amazing for me, Kelly, because it tells me that God cares for our physical appearance just as he cares about our intellect, mind, spirit. And that's why he himself gave us the breath of life, which is the spirit that he breathed into our nostrils. And that's how life began. It is amazing that if you take out that breath of life, the person is dead. Even though the body is still complete, the person is dead. And you cannot have breath of life by itself. It needs a body in order to become a living person, a living being. So, do you know that the Bible actually tells you the same formula, but totally the opposite?
Right.
So, you know that?
Yeah, it's very interesting because in a lesson, actually, they compare the breath of life to technically all our memories, our character, all our self, but that can only be made manifest through a living person as a combination of the body and soul. And think of it as a computer or a battery.
Or a light bulb or something like that, yes.
Yeah, a light bulb by itself cannot function. It is dead. It has to be connected to a source of power to make sure it lights up and functions the way it's supposed to.
Yes, and that's true. So let's go to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12. That's the last chapter of the book. And it's very interesting because it begins with the famous, remember the Lord in the days of your youth. Remember, let me see how it says. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days comes and the years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them. So basically it's telling you, like, when you're young, when you are strong, when you have all the energy, remember your Creator. But then it goes and says, there are going to be some days in which you will not have pleasure. And then it uses a series of analogies of what happens when you get older and what happens after you get older, you die. And the verse 7 specifically tells us exactly what happens when somebody dies. Can you read that for me, please?
Verse 7?
Yes.
Okay. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it.
So basically, this is the whole formula that we just read at the very beginning. We're going backwards because we sin, now we die. And the dust, the body, goes back to the dust. And the breath of life, which is the spirit, goes back to God, which is not a separate entity that thinks, that feels, but just the breath of life that comes from God. So it is amazing to know that the Bible, the most reliable book in the whole history of humanity that has survived many eras and epochs of history, tells us the beginning of life comes from God. And then the end of life, God himself says or reveals what happens after we die. So we are sure that this is the end of this earthly life. But in order to close, Caleb, I have a question that I didn't have scripted, and the question is there going to be more life after death, or is that going to be it forever? Is there going to be reincarnation, resurrection, or any other thing? What does the Bible say about that? Do you know?
So somewhat, yeah, I think we can probably go to perhaps First Thessalonians chapter 5. And maybe it does answer that question because I believe somewhere it mentions really not really how or where the dead go, because there is this what's it called? I believe it might have been actually
It's
second.
4.
That's 4?
Yes, is First Thessalonians chapter 4.
Okay. Very well. Let me see.
13.
But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. So kind of make a pause right here. Really, there will be life after death, but it says right here, till the coming of the Lord. So it's actually an event that's going to happen. It's not someone dies and goes immediately to heaven. It's actually, because it makes no sense that if people die and go to heaven or hell, what's the point of the resurrection? What's the point of the judgment? All the events that happen after the second coming of Christ. So, and sleep is a euphemism for being dead. And then we see that a lot in the Bible. When David dies, when Abraham dies, it says they were buried and they slept with their father.
Even Jesus said that when Lazarus died, he slept, and I'm going to go and wake him up. So the fact that this death is compared to sleep means that eventually the person is going to wake up and begin to think. I'm going to be back, bring it back to the book of Ecclesiastes, and probably we can read one more verse. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 5, 6, because it talks about what happens when somebody dies, and this is easy to understand, easy peasy, as some people will say. Verse 5 and 6. What does it say in your Bible?
For chapter 5? Or
Chapter 9.
chapter 9?
Verse 5 and 6.
Okay, chapter 9, verse 5 and 6. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished, neither they have any more a portion for even and anything that is done under the sun. One thing I want to point out, what I notice about Platonic dualism is that the soul possesses, is able to reach these thoughts, these emotions. So the Bible declares to us that these emotions like love, envy, and hate are not present. They are dead or the person doesn't possess them anymore. That means the soul, when the Bible presents that the soul isn't immortal. It loses those qualities like that Plato said that the soul being eternal possesses, but right here it says it loses them.
Yes, totally right, Caleb. Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with me. Time's up, and it's time to close up with this episode of Link Youth Afterlife. We hope that you enjoyed this time with us, and if you liked something that we said or did here while we were doing this podcast, please share it in the comments. And also, if you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, we're trying to produce more content related to afterlife and some issues that are interesting to youthful minds, or the minds of the youth, and we're trying to do the best to meet those needs. So thank you so much again for watching, and if you even don't agree with something that we said, please say that in your comment. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day.